I spent 40 minutes watching the cheap, gilded frame of my father's favorite portrait bounce in the back of a cardboard box marked Goodwill, and I already knew that one hidden piece of paper taped behind his sepia smile was going to dismantle my sister's entire existence. That envelope turned out to be his true last will, and its discovery didn't just reclaim my inheritance. It built an entire business from the wreckage of her fraud, a business where she now dusts my antiques in an apron that announces her crime to every customer who walks through the door. My name is Clara, and I turned 52 the week my father died. For 29 years, I was the person who pureed his meals, tracked his medication calendar, and sat through every neurology appointment while my sister Elaine sent a poinsettia at Christmas and called it filial devotion. I gave up a locksmith apprenticeship that paid my rent at 19, then walked away from a nursing scholarship at 24 because Parkinson's doesn't schedule around career plans. My father once told me that the truest skill a person can have is the ability to open something that's been closed to them, whether it's a door or a bank vault, or a lie someone built to keep them out. He taught me to pick my first lock when I was 12, a rusty padlock on the garden shed, and he said the pins inside a cylinder are just tiny steel secrets waiting to be told. I never forgot that, and I never stopped carrying a small flathead screwdriver and a tension wrench in my pocket, no matter what else I gave up. My father's favorite object in the whole house was an oil portrait of himself at 30, painted on a humid afternoon in the French Quarter. He hung it in the parlor and told me 1,000 times that the young man in the frame had 2 working hands and a daughter who still believed he could catch her when she jumped off the porch railing. I dusted that portrait every Saturday for 3 decades, the way you'd polish a sacred relic, because I knew what it meant to him. Dad's stroke came without warning on a Tuesday morning. I was measuring his blood pressure when the left side of his face dropped like wet clay. He squeezed my wrist once hard, and then he was gone before the paramedics could clear the front hallway. I sat in the emergency room alone with his wallet and his reading glasses, and I made the calls, my voice steady on the outside while something inside me shattered into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. Elaine and her husband Trent arrived 22 hours later in a black leased SUV with a U-Haul trailer hitched to the back. They didn't bring flowers or a casserole or even a condolence card. They brought a binder of legal documents and a $4,000 espresso machine Trent insisted on plugging into my father's kitchen before the obituary had even been printed, the machine hissing and sputtering like it was marking its territory. Trent was the sort of man who wore a full suit to a funeral visitation and checked his stock portfolio during the eulogy. Elaine floated through the house with a clipboard, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a metronome counting down a takeover, tagging furniture with little neon stickers in orange and pink and lime green, as if cataloging inventory for a liquidation sale. I was still wearing the same sweater from the hospital, the left cuff stained with coffee from the waiting room vending machine, and my hair was unwashed and pinned back with a clip I'd found in my purse. They started in the parlor first. I walked in to find Elaine yanking frames off the walls, her manicured nails leaving scratches in the century-old plaster, the sound of ripping nails from drywall like small bones snapping. She held up my father's portrait between 2 fingers, her face pinched like she'd found a dead roach. "This old thing is so dusty," she said, and dropped it into a cardboard box labeled Goodwill without looking at me, the frame landing with a hollow thud against a chipped ceramic lamp. "Clara, you really let the house go. We'll handle everything now. You just rest. You've been through so much." The false sympathy dripped off her tongue like rancid honey. I didn't argue. I stood in the corner and watched them strip the room of everything my father had touched, the wingback chair where he'd read me Robert Frost poems, the side table where his medication organizer sat with Tuesday's pills still waiting. And I waited until 3 in the morning when the house fell silent. Trent was snoring in the guest room, a wet rattling sound that vibrated through the wall. Elaine had taken over my father's bedroom, her high-end skincare bottles already lined up on his dresser like a military occupation, her silk pillowcase replacing the flannel one I'd washed the day before he died. I crept down to the garage in my bare feet, the concrete cold and gritty against my soles, found the Goodwill box, and pulled the portrait free. The frame smelled like lemon polish, my lemon polish, the kind I used every week and had to order from a specialty catalog because the grocery store brand left streaks on the old varnish. I carried it to the kitchen and sat under the single bulb above the sink, the light casting a yellow cone in the dark house. What I told myself was that I wanted to clean the glass properly before donating it, a final act of care. What I actually did was run my fingers along the back of the frame, feeling the brittle brown paper that had been stretched across the canvas for decades. I'd seen my father mount that painting when I was a child, his hands steady before the tremors started, using a small brush to apply glue along the wooden stretcher bars. He'd pressed the paper down with a bone folder, sealing the back, and then he'd stopped, looked at me, and said, "A frame isn't just decoration. It's a little vault. People forget the back is just as important as the front." That memory washed over me as I found the edge of the paper, slightly loose in one corner, the adhesive yellowed and brittle. I peeled it back carefully, using my fingernail to lift the medical tape, the same kind he'd used to fasten gauze over my scraped knees when I was 7 and had fallen off my bike. Underneath, tucked flat against the canvas, was a legal-sized envelope sealed with a small disc of red wax, the kind that comes from a kit you'd buy at a stationery store, not melted by a fancy signet ring, but pressed with the flat bottom of a quarter. The front read, in my father's unmistakable sloping cursive, the letters leaning forward as if they were in a hurry. "To my dear Clara, only in the event of my death." I opened it with a butter knife from the drawer, the same knife I'd used that morning to scrape the burnt edges off his toast. Inside was a last will and testament, 3 pages, notarized and witnessed by 2 neighbors who had since passed away, their signatures faded but legible. Everything was left to me. The house, the brokerage account, the insurance policy, the mineral rights to a tiny plot of land in Oklahoma that paid $80 a year. But it was the final page that made my hands shake. Beneath the signatures, scribbled in the same pen but with the letters jagged and rushed, my father had written, "Do not trust them. Save yourself." I sat there for a long time, the envelope trembling in my hand, and I understood that my father had known what was coming. He had watched Elaine's avarice from afar, seen the way she treated his illness like an inconvenience, heard the demands for early inheritance over crackling phone calls, and he had chosen to hide the truth in plain sight, in the one object he knew I would protect even when everything else was stripped away. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family shouldn't be allowed to rewrite the truth with a forged signature. I slept maybe 90 minutes that night, the envelope pressed flat beneath my mattress, its edges digging into my back like a promise. By 7 in the morning, Elaine was at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a pen already uncapped, positioned like a weapon. The espresso machine gurgled behind her, filling the room with a bitter, burnt smell. Trent stood behind her, scrolling through his phone but watching me with the dead-eyed focus of a debt collector who'd been through this routine a dozen times before. "We talked to an attorney," Elaine said, her voice honeyed and slow, the tone she used on waitstaff she planned to stiff. "Probate is going to be such a nightmare, Clara, and you're clearly not in a state to manage it. Dad had all these loose accounts and a reverse mortgage we didn't know about. There are liens, there are outstanding medical bills from the nursing agency you used. There are property taxes that haven't been filed in 18 months. We're looking at a serious financial mess. We just need you to sign a power of attorney and a quitclaim on the house so we can take care of you. Consolidate everything. Sell the property. You've been through so much, you shouldn't have to worry about this on top of your grief." She slid the papers across the table, and I watched them glide over the wood like a puck on ice. I scanned the text upside down while pretending to fumble for my reading glasses, the ones I'd left in the hospital waiting room, but didn't actually need. The power of attorney was a universal grant, giving her control over every financial account and legal decision dating back 3 years, which would retroactively authorize any transactions she'd already made. The quitclaim would transfer the house to her name entirely, with a clause that released her from any obligation to provide me with housing or care. There was no provision for a trust, no allowance for my expenses, no mention of the insurance policy or brokerage accounts. It was a full corporate liquidation dressed up as concern, and the signatures at the bottom were already filled in with my name typed beneath a blank line, waiting for my hand. I let my eyes go foggy, my mouth slack. "I just need a day," I said, the words syrupy and spent, dragging each syllable out like a worn-out elastic band. My head is so foggy since Daddy passed. I can't think straight. I keep forgetting to eat. I can't remember where I put my shoes. Can we do this tomorrow? I just need to rest. I'm so tired, Elaine. Elaine's jaw tightened so briefly I might have missed it if I weren't already cataloging every micro-expression, the way a nurse watches for the first twitch of a seizure. Trent's thumb froze on his screen. Of course, sweetie, Elaine said, patting my hand, her palm cool and dry. Of course. We'll take care of everything. Why don't you come stay with us for a few weeks? This house is just too much for you right now. The dust, the stairs, all these memories. It's not healthy. We've got the guest room ready. It's got a view of the garden. You'll love it. Let us handle the paperwork while you recover. I told her that sounded lovely, and I meant it in the way a fox finds a henhouse lovely. I packed a single bag. The envelope with the reel will zipped into the lining of my old suitcase, and I let them drive me across town to their 2-story colonial with the immaculate landscaping and the overdue property tax liens I would later uncover in triplicate. The guest room smelled like lavender plug-in air fresheners and had a lock on the outside of the door, which I noticed immediately and filed away like a piece of evidence. That first week, I became a professional ghost. I shuffled around in an old Channel bathrobe I'd brought from home, the elbows worn thin, my hair unwashed and pulled into a greasy knot. I answered questions with vague nods and long silences, sometimes letting a spoon clatter from my hand at dinner to reinforce the image of mental fog. Elaine and Trent treated me like a piece of medical equipment they'd inherited and didn't know where to plug in, a dialysis machine with a frayed cord. They made no effort to include me in meals, which was perfect, because I ate standing at the kitchen window, nibbling on saltine crackers, observing the choreography of their financial collapse like a nature documentarian studying a wounded animal. The red flags started with Trent's phone calls. He'd step onto the back patio at odd hours, 6 a.m. or 11:30 at night, sliding the glass door shut but never quite latching it, a gap of cold air I could feel from the hallway. I'd stand just inside the pantry, frozen, my bathrobe sleeve pressed against a shelf of canned tomatoes, listening. The conversations were a mosaic of desperation, stitched together with jargon I would later look up and fully understand. The margin call is in 60 days, Dennis. I don't have 60 days. Liquidate the position. No, I don't care what the loss is, just liquidate. I need cash flowing by Monday morning. Or, the Cayman account is frozen. What do you mean frozen? No, I can't get a lawyer. That's the whole point of a shell, you idiot. A shell doesn't have legal standing to fight an asset freeze. The words shell and frozen account and post-dated and balloon payment became a recurring background noise, a soundtrack of ruin. One afternoon, I heard him say, if the old lady goes to probate, the whole thing unravels, the auditor will find the cross-collateralization. We need the signature by Friday or we're done. Done. Are you hearing me? Elaine's spending didn't pause for the disaster. UPS trucks delivered boxes daily. Italian leather boots, a $1,200 robotic cat litter box for a cat they didn't own, a sous vide machine still in its Amazon shrink wrap, a crystal decanter set that arrived with a note reading for entertaining clients. The dining room became a graveyard of cardboard boxes, and every evening Elaine would slice them open with a gold-plated letter opener, cooing over her purchases while Trent stared at his laptop screen with the rictus of a man watching his life support beep flatline. I found a shredder bin in the study overflowing with documents she'd attempted to destroy, and that became my second piece of material evidence. I waited until the house was empty, Elaine at a lunch meeting that I suspected was actually a Nordstrom appointment, and Trent at a coffee shop supposedly meeting a business partner, but probably avoiding a creditor. I knelt on the carpet, the fibers leaving waffle marks on my knees, and I pieced the confetti back together with surgical tape from a first aid kit in the bathroom, the same painstaking method I'd used to read damaged medication labels when Dad's vision went, and he couldn't tell if a pill bottle said metformin or metoprolol. The puzzle revealed 4 maxed-out credit cards totaling $47,000 in revolving debt, with interest rates over 29%. One statement showed a cash advance taken out the same week my father's funeral was announced. The transaction note reading, cash, funeral expenses. Except the funeral had been paid for by a prepaid plan I'd set up years earlier through a local mortuary, a plan my father and I had reviewed together over cups of weak tea. The cash advance had gone straight into their checking account, and according to the matching debit history, it had been spent on a deposit for a luxury vacation to Tuscany that was scheduled for the following spring. The household accident happened on a Thursday. The garbage disposal seized mid-cycle, choking on a chicken bone, and Elaine shrieked like a tea kettle that had boiled dry, a high piercing sound that cut through the house. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, flapping her hands, her rings catching the light, while Trent shouted from the study that he was on a call and couldn't deal with domestic incompetence. I shuffled over in my bathrobe, my feet in worn slippers, and crouched under the sink. The plumbing smelled like rotting vegetables and old soap. I reached for the disposal's reset button on the bottom of the motor housing. It clicked, nothing, the hum of a jammed rotor filling the cabinet. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from my robe pocket, a relic from my locksmithing days that I never left home without, its shaft worn smooth from decades of turning tiny screws and probing keyways. I located the manual override socket on the bottom of the disposal unit and inserted the screwdriver, turning it counterclockwise with a firm twist, feeling the resistance of the jammed bone give way. Then I fished out the chicken bone shards with my fingers, wiped the rubber splash guard clean, and had the disposal humming in 38 seconds. I stood up and wiped my hands on a dish towel. Elaine was staring at me, her Starbucks cup frozen halfway to her lips, a thin rivulet of condensation running down the side. "How did you do that?" she asked, and for the first time there was a thin wire of suspicion in her voice, a note of sharpness beneath the honey. I gave her my foggiest smile. "I used to fix things when Daddy's hands got bad. The disposal, the leaky faucets, the washing machine that always threw the belt. It's just a disposal, Elaine." She said nothing, but I saw her exchange a look with Trent that night at dinner, a look that said I might not be as pliable as they'd planned, a look that chilled the room more than the air conditioning. The filing cabinet was in Trent's study, a squat steel unit with a cheap wafer lock on the top drawer, the kind you'd find in a low-budget office supply catalog. I'd noticed it the day I arrived, its surface dull gray, a faint circle of rust around the keyhole from years of jabbing with sweaty keys. I needed the house empty to work. That opportunity came on Saturday afternoon, when they announced they were attending a business lunch and would be gone 4 hours, giving me a window as clean as a freshly washed pane of glass. I waited until their taillights cleared the corner, the sound of the SUV's engine fading into the suburban hum of leaf blowers and distant lawn mowers. Then I walked into the study barefoot, the soles of my feet silent on the plush beige carpet, to avoid leaving footprint impressions that could be noticed later. The room smelled like old coffee and the faint acetone whiff of dry erase markers from a whiteboard calendar that listed deadlines in a code of initials I didn't yet understand. The lock was a standard 5-pin wafer mechanism, the kind I'd been picking since I was 17 years old in my uncle's locksmith shop on Clifton Avenue. That shop had smelled of machine oil and the dusty heat of a key-cutting grinder, and my uncle, a patient man with nicotine-stained fingers, had taught me that every lock is a conversation between the key and the pins. I unbent a hairpin into a small rake, bending the tip into a slight wave, and twisted a paperclip into a tension wrench with a 90-degree bend at the end, the same tools I'd used 1,000 times on residential deadbolts before I'd traded my tool belt for a nursing textbook. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied light torque with my left hand, a gentle clockwise pressure just enough to bind the wafers. Then I raked the pins with the hairpin, a quick in and out motion, feeling the soft clicks as each wafer set into the shear line. On the third pass, the plug turned with a smooth, satisfying metallic rotation, and the lock opened. The whole process took 11 seconds, and for a moment I was 19 again, standing in a rain-soaked alley opening a car door for a frantic woman who'd locked her keys inside and was about to miss her daughter's graduation. Inside, the files were organized with the same sloppy greed Elaine applied to everything. There were manila folders with tabs written in Trent's blocky handwriting, the kind of font a person uses when they think they are being meticulous but are actually telegraphing their anxiety. The folders were labeled Dad Estate and Dad Insurance and Dad Brokerage and Legal Consult. I flipped through them and felt my pulse go cold, the blood draining from my face like water from a punctured bucket. The forged will was the first document, a nearly identical copy of the real one I'd found behind the portrait, printed on heavy bond paper, the same weight and watermark. Except the beneficiary line had been clumsily altered, the name Clara scratched out with a fine point pen, and Elaine written over it in a different ink, the handwriting too even, too practiced, clearly traced from another document. My father's signature at the bottom was a carbon copy of the genuine article, but the pressure was wrong, the pen strokes lacking the tremor of his Parkinson's, that slight quiver I knew as well as my own breath. A notary stamp with a date 2 weeks before his death had been added, the notary a name I didn't recognize. Later, investigators would discover the notary was a former administrative assistant of Trent's, who'd been paid $500 in cash to stamp whatever he placed in front of her without reading it. The second folder held a life insurance policy with a face value of $240,000 from a company called Heritage Mutual. The original beneficiary designation named me, Clara Wren, sole daughter, dated 12 years ago, with my social security number typed in the correct format. Behind it was a change of beneficiary form, dated the month before my father's death, redirecting the entire payout to Elaine. My father's signature was a jagged scrawl that looked close to his real signature, but not quite right, the loop on the J too broad, the cross of the T too high. I held the form up to the light streaming through the study window, and I saw the faint impression of tracing lines underneath, the telltale ghost of a light table. They'd used a cheap portable light box, the kind you'd buy at a craft store, to trace his signature from a legitimate document, probably the birthday card I'd seen him send Elaine the year before, the one she'd never thanked him for. The third folder was a debt consolidation plan in Trent's name, printed on a spreadsheet with columns of numbers that bled into each other like a wound. It listed the same credit card debts I'd pieced together, plus a balloon payment on a commercial loan for a failed franchise investment in a juice bar chain that had gone bankrupt inside 18 months. The total was just under $250,000, nearly the exact value of my father's insurance payout. The math was grotesquely simple. Elaine and Trent needed my inheritance to stay out of bankruptcy, and they'd constructed an entire fraudulent estate to seize it, a trap with my name written in invisible ink at the bottom. I photographed every document with my phone, inch by inch, holding the camera steady, capturing the grain of the paper and the texture of the forged ink, the way I'd been trained to document patient charts in nursing school, where a misplaced decimal could mean death. I replaced the files in exact order, aligning the tabs and the paper clips, and relocked the cabinet with a reverse turn of my tension wrench, the lock snapping back into place with a click that felt like a door closing on their future. I was sitting in the guest room pretending to doze, my breath slow, and even when they returned, their voices carrying the false cheer of people who just spent a lunch convincing themselves their plan was foolproof. The reel will included an attachment I hadn't fully processed that first night, a single typed page I'd glossed over in my shock and grief. It was titled Beneficiary Trust Instructions, signed by my father 9 years earlier, the paper slightly yellowed but the ink still sharp. The document explained that my father, in consultation with an estate attorney, had moved all his liquid assets, the brokerage account and the insurance policy and a few small certificates of deposit, into a payable on death trust with me as the sole inheritor, a designation that bypassed probate entirely. The trust had a very specific safeguard, a dead man's switch he'd designed with the attorney's help. Any withdrawal or transfer of funds exceeding $500 required both my physical presence at the issuing bank and a biometric verification scan tied to my fingerprint, a scan that was stored in the bank's secure database and could not be duplicated or overridden by any paper document. No signature, no power of attorney, no forged will could override it. The trust was irrevocable, established by an estate attorney named Henry Corbin, whose business card was paper-clipped to the page, the card slightly dog-eared from being tucked inside that envelope for years. I called Henry Corbin the next morning from a burner phone I'd bought at a gas station the night before, paying in cash while wearing a baseball cap pulled low, feeling like a character in a spy novel, but not caring because the stakes were my entire future. I used the landline number on his card, and the man who answered had a voice like a retired drill sergeant, gravel and precision, and the kind of authority that comes from 40 years of wrestling with probate courts. "This is Henry Corbin," he said, no preamble. I introduced myself, recited the trust document number from the top of the page, and waited while I heard the rustle of papers and the click of a keyboard. "Miss Wren," he said, after a long pause so heavy I could feel it pressing on my eardrum, "your father came to me 8 years ago with concerns about his elder daughter. He said she'd been pressuring him for money, calling him at odd hours, sending letters from attorneys, demanding an early inheritance. He didn't trust her, but he didn't want to disinherit her openly and cause a family war while he was still alive, still vulnerable in that chair. So he built a trap. He made sure that anyone who tried to access those funds without you would hit a wall, and that wall would trigger an automatic fraud investigation with my compliance team. I've already been notified about the forged documents the bank received last week, the change of beneficiary form, and the fake will. The account is frozen, the insurance payout is flagged, and I've been waiting for your call. I've been waiting for you to tell me you're safe." I asked him what I needed to do, my voice small. He told me to continue playing the confused invalid, to let Elaine and Trent believe they were close to victory, to let their confidence build like pressure in a sealed boiler. The bank had assigned an investigator from their financial crimes unit, a woman named Detective Karen Okonkwo, who specialized in elder fraud and had already reviewed the forged signatures. Corbin would coordinate with her. All they needed was one moment. Elaine and Trent trying to force me to access the trust funds or the safety deposit box in person, the moment their coercion was documented by the bank's security cameras and audio. Then the fraud team could move, and the entire structure of their lies would collapse on top of them. I agreed, but I had to ask one more question. Did he know how far she would go? Did my father know she'd forge a will? Corbin was quiet for a moment, and I heard him exhale slowly, the sound of an old man choosing his words. "He knew enough to protect you," he said. "He told me once my youngest knows how to open a lock, but she's never had to open a lie. I need to make sure she has the key before it's too late. That's all that matters, Miss Wren. He gave you the key." 3 days later, I decided to test the depth of Elaine's humanity. I had no medical conditions, but I'd spent 29 years watching my father's body betray him. The way his hands would freeze mid-motion, the way his face would go slack when the dopamine levels dipped, and I could mimic a syncopal episode with unsettling accuracy. I waited until Trent and Elaine were in the parlor, arguing over a new credit card bill that had arrived in a pink envelope marked "Final Notice," in bold red letters, the same kind of envelope that had been showing up twice a week. They were standing near the bay window, the afternoon sun cutting harsh lines across their faces, their voices climbing like a duet of impending doom. I walked into the room, paused, then let my knees buckle, the way I'd seen a patient go down in the cardiology unit during my clinical rotations, a sudden drop like a puppet with cut strings. I clutched my chest, my left hand gripping the fabric of my bathrobe over my heart, gasped a wet choking sound, and collapsed sideways onto the hardwood floor, my head bouncing once against the baseboard with a dull thud that I felt in my molars. My eyes fluttered and then half closed, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. It was a textbook cardiac event, the kind I'd responded to dozens of times during training, and I waited for the reaction I knew in my gut was coming. Elaine looked over. She literally looked over my convulsing body, her eyes scanning down, her gaze passing over my twitching fingers and my pale face and my chest heaving against the floor, and she looked back up to Trent, and she said, "I don't care what the interest rate is. We can't make the minimum payment on all 4. We need to talk about restructuring. We need to call that consolidation company I sent you the link for." She stepped over my legs, her silk slipper brushing my shin, the fabric cool and impersonal, and she reached down to the floor where the pink envelope had fallen. She picked it up and held it out to him. Trent didn't even glance in my direction. He was too busy pointing at the statement, jabbing his finger at a line item, and arguing about a late fee that had been added for a payment that was 6 days overdue. I lay on the floor, controlling my breathing, my eyes cracked open just enough to record every detail, the dust motes floating in the sunbeam, the scuff mark on the toe of Trent's loafers, the way Elaine's wedding ring caught the light as she gestured. This was not negligence. Negligence was forgetting to call back a pharmacist or leaving a burner on low. This was a cold, fast calculation. My death in their house would be paperwork, a delay, an irritation, a minor obstacle to be worked around, nothing more. After 90 seconds, I sat up slowly, using my elbows, and walked out of the room without a word. I walked past them like I was already a ghost, and they didn't notice. They were still arguing about the minimum payment, their voices fading as I closed the guest room door behind me. That night, I brushed my teeth in the guest bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink, the glass flecked with toothpaste spatter from a previous guest. The woman in the mirror looked tired but clear-eyed, the fog I'd been performing for weeks completely burned away. I whispered to her, to myself, my breath fogging the glass. No more, not one more second of this. The confrontation came 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning. Elaine and Trent had spent the previous evening having a hushed, frantic conversation in their bedroom, the words muffled but the tone unmistakable, and I'd pressed my ear to the wall long enough to catch the phrase, safety deposit box. And the bank needs her physically present. She's the only signatory on the trust. They believed the original stock certificates and bearer bonds my father had owned were stored in a safety deposit box at First Mercantile Bank, and they believed my physical presence was the only obstacle left between them and the money. They were right about the second part. At 8:30, Elaine came to my room in a soft cardigan and her caring daughter face, the one she'd practiced in the mirror until it looked almost human. "Clara, honey, we need to run a quick errand. Dad had a little box at the bank, just some old papers and maybe a few bonds, and they just need you to sign some forms so we can close his accounts. Nothing complicated, just a signature and a thumbprint. I'll be with you the whole time. We can get lunch after, anywhere you want." I dressed in an old gray cardigan of my father's, the one he'd worn on cold mornings when I'd made him oatmeal with brown sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, the wool still carrying the faint ghost of his aftershave. I tucked the real will, the trust document, and the photographs of the forged files into a canvas tote bag that had once held library books about estate planning, a small irony I savored. I let Elaine guide me into the back of their SUV like a fragile package, her hand on my elbow a little too tight, a little too insistent. First Mercantile Bank was a limestone building with brass fixtures and teller counters that had survived the Great Depression, the kind of place where the floors were polished marble and the air smelled like old money and lemon wax. The branch manager, Mr. Wallace, was a tall black man in a perfectly pressed suit with a tie bar that reflected the chandelier light. He had been briefed by Henry Corbin and Detective Okonkwo, and he welcomed us with professional warmth, his handshake firm and his eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something that looked like recognition. He led us to a private office off the main lobby, a room with mahogany paneling and a long table that smelled of furniture polish, where the request forms for the safety deposit box were already laid out. "We just need the surviving heir to verify identity and provide the box key, Mr. Wallace said, sliding a digital fingerprint scanner across the polished wood, its surface a small glass square that glowed with a blue light. "Standard procedure for trust assets. It won't take but a moment." Elaine smiled tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line that looked more like a wound than a smile. "Of course. Clara, just put your finger right there, sweetie, just like at the doctor's office." I placed my index finger on the scanner, feeling the cool glass against my skin, the faint hum of the machine reading the whorls and ridges that were unique to me and me alone. It beeped green, a soft affirmative chime. "Mr." Wallace nodded, made a note on a clipboard, and excused himself to retrieve the box from the vault, a process that would take several minutes, he said, because of the dual authentication protocol. The moment he left, the soft click of the door latch felt like a starter pistol. Elaine's mask slipped so fast I could almost hear it clatter to the floor. "When he comes back, you're going to sign whatever he puts in front of you," she said, her voice dropping to a hiss, the honey gone and replaced with vinegar. "You're going to sign it without reading it, without asking questions, without any of your little foggy act delays, and then we're going home. Do you understand? This is for Dad's estate. This is for the family. Don't make this difficult, Clara. Don't you dare make this difficult after everything we've done for you." I looked at her. I looked at her face, which was now just a mask of greed and terror, the fine lines around her mouth deepening like cracks in old porcelain. I looked at Trent, who was standing by the door, his hand resting on the frame, his body angled to block the exit, his knuckles white. I reached into my tote bag, the canvas rustling, and pulled out the envelope with the real will. I held it up, my father's handwriting visible on the front, the words to my dear Clara stark against the cream paper. "I will not be a footnote in your debt consolidation plan, Elaine," I said. My voice was steady, the fog gone for good, the words clear and sharp as a scalpel. I found the real will behind Dad's portrait. I know about the forged documents, the life insurance change, the credit card debt that matches the payout exactly. I've been photographing your files for weeks. This ends now, right now. The office door opened. Mr. Wallace stepped aside, and in walked Detective Okonkwo, a woman in a navy blazer with a badge clipped to her belt, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a representative from the district attorney's financial crimes unit, a young man carrying a leather briefcase and a digital audio recorder. The detective was holding a warrant and a copy of the forged change of beneficiary form I'd photographed in Trent's study, the paper slightly curled from being handled. Elaine's face went through 6 emotions in 3 seconds: confusion, recognition, terror, rage, then a blank paralysis, and finally a desperate, scrabbling fury. She snatched at the real will, her nails grazing the edge of the envelope, but I pulled it back, and her fingers closed on empty air. She made a sound that was half scream, half sob. Trent lunged toward the door and ran directly into the chest of a 6'4" officer who'd been positioned specifically for that move, a solid wall of muscle and polyester that didn't budge. He bounced off and sagged against the wall, his carefully constructed facade collapsing into a whimper about needing to call his lawyer, his phone falling from his hand and skittering across the marble floor. Detective Okonkwo read Elaine her rights in a calm, even tone, each Miranda word dropping into the room like a stone into still water. A forensics specialist wearing blue nitrile gloves bagged the forged documents that Elaine had brought in a leather folder, the same folder she'd likely planned to use to present the fraudulent will to the bank. The real will was authenticated on the spot by a notary the bank kept on staff, an older woman who compared the signatures under a magnifying lamp and nodded. Elaine's forgery was exposed by 2 simple facts. My father's genuine signature used a specific fountain pen with a flexible nib that matched the slant and tremor of his known samples, and the notary stamp she'd used came from a logbook that the real notary had never signed, the stamp number traceable to a different notary who'd reported her seal missing 6 months before. Within 7 hours, Elaine had been charged with 3 counts of felony, probate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. Trent faced identical charges, plus an additional count of money laundering, tied to the Cayman shell he'd bragged about on his patio calls, the one that was now being unfrozen by a federal investigation. The legal aftermath lasted 14 months. Elaine's defense attorney, a man with a nervous cough and a cheap suit, argued emotional distress and family dysfunction, painting Elaine as a misunderstood caretaker who'd been excluded from her father's life. The jury, a group of 12 people who'd each sat through 3 weeks of testimony, saw the filmed footage from the bank conference room, the photographs of the forged files, and the video of my staged collapse that Detective Okonkwo had persuaded me to reenact for the record, a clinical recreation where I narrated my actions and Elaine's complete disregard was played back in high definition on a courtroom monitor. They heard Trent's recorded phone calls about liquidating positions and freezing accounts, and they saw the bank records that showed the cash advance taken on my father's funeral day. Elaine was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with an additional 5 years of supervised probation and a permanent prohibition from serving as anyone's power of attorney. Trent received 3 years and a permanent ban from any fiduciary role or financial management position. The house, the insurance payout, the brokerage accounts, everything my father had intended for me, reverted to my name free and clear. The trust's dead man switch performed exactly as he designed it. When I finally accessed the funds with my fingerprint and presence, the payout was instant, a $240,000 deposit into an account I opened that very afternoon with Mr. Wallace's help, the numbers appearing on the screen like a small miracle. I could have simply sold the house and moved on, bought a little condo somewhere with a view of a lake, and spent my days reading. But my father's portrait had survived the attempted purge, and I'd hung it back in the parlor the day the locks were changed, the glass cleaned and the frame polished, his young face watching the room with that half-smile he always had. The room felt empty without him, but it also felt like a space that deserved a new purpose, something that took the wreckage of betrayal and turned it into something tangible and solid. I'd spent 3 decades managing a household, budgeting for specialized equipment, organizing his medical supplies with the precision of a quartermaster. I understood the value of things, not just sentimental value but fair market value, the difference between a genuine Victorian mourning brooch and a reproduction, the way a stickly chair's joinery could be dated to within 5 years by the shape of the tenon and the patina of the quarter-sawn oak. So I took the insurance money, I took the house, and I turned the parlor into the front office of Heirloom of Deceit estate sales. The business model was simple. I liquidated estates for families, appraised antiques for a flat fee, and ran consignment sales out of the same rooms where Elaine had once slapped neon stickers on my father's belongings. I learned the auction software, the inventory management systems, the tax codes for tangible personal property sales, and I found that I was good at it, better than good, because I treated every object like a story someone had tried to erase. But I added one signature touch, a quiet, permanent footnote that I designed with a local printing shop. Every price tag on every item, from a cranberry glass pitcher to a chifforobe with a secret drawer, prints a small line of text at the bottom in a serif font. Probate case no. 23 CF 00412. Elaine's docket number from the fraud indictment. It's not loud, not aggressive, just a permanent watermark, a breadcrumb of truth that follows her crime into every household that buys a candlestick or a quilt or a set of monogrammed silver spoons. When customers ask, I tell them it's a provenance mark, a little historical footnote. Most of them nod and smile and never suspect they're carrying a piece of my sister's downfall into their own homes. As part of her probation conditions, Elaine is required to maintain lawful employment and perform 200 hours of community restitution, and she cannot work in any role involving financial management or notary services. I offered her a job, and her probation officer approved it because the alternative was a re-entry program with a janitorial crew, and she has a dust allergy that makes her eyes water. She dusts the antiques, mops the hardwood floors with a solution I mix from vinegar and water, and straightens the doilies in the window display, her movements slow and deliberate. She wears a canvas apron that I had embroidered at a shop downtown, the letters a bold serif font in dark thread. Wiped away the truth. It's a phrase she once spat at me during cross-examination, screaming it across the courtroom, claiming that I was the one who had wiped away the truth by hiding the real will instead of presenting it to her immediately. The irony was too perfect not to stitch into fabric and make her wear against her chest like a scarlet letter. Customers sometimes ask about the apron, glancing at the words, and then at Elaine's downturned face. I tell them it's a little inside joke, a family motto. My sister keeps her head down and says nothing, because the alternative is a violation of her probation, and even she understands that the truth, once written in thread and docket numbers, cannot be wiped away. My father's portrait hangs over the cash register now, the young man with 2 working hands and a daughter he taught to pick locks and read the fine print and never, ever trust a liar with a pen. Every time a sale closes, I hear the old register ding, a sound like a small bell of justice, and I think about that last line he scrawled for me, the ink slightly smeared from the pressure of his hand. Do not trust them, save yourself. He didn't just warn me, he armed me. He built a lock I could open with nothing but my own fingerprint and a lifetime of patience and skill that he knew she could never match, because she never once took the time to understand how a lock works, how a trust works, how love works. Integrity isn't just about telling the truth. It's about constructing a world where the truth becomes inevitable, a mechanism that clicks into place whether or not anyone is watching, like the pins in a wafer lock aligning perfectly under the lightest touch. My father understood that, and every morning when I turn the sign in the parlor window to open, I understand it a little more. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, hit like and subscribe for more tales of justice delivered not with a bang, but with a perfectly filed docket number. We'll see you in the next one.